Buenos días a todos en este tercer día
Good morning. Let me welcome you to this third day of the South School of Internet Governance Conference. Greetings from Buenos Aires. I have the privilege and honor to introduce you to a friend of ours, Chris Painter. Chris Painter is a worldwide authority on cybersecurity. He has been the main consultant to Barack Obama, the former president of the United States, and he's a founder of the Fiverr Forum of Global Expertise on Cybersecurity. Chris is a friend of ours. I will switch to English in a moment. Chris is a friend of ours, dating back to 2015 when we organized the first meeting in Costa Rica. He has been here in person or virtually, like right now, so I acknowledge his presence. He has a busy agenda. He has been traveling a lot. Well, not now because of the pandemic. So let's welcome him. I'm going to switch to English right now. And hopefully you will enjoy his presentation, and later we are going to open the Q&A for questions and answers.
Thank you so much for being with us this morning. And Buenos morning for you. You're in Washington?
I'm in Washington, yeah.
How are you? How have you been during all this very strange year and a half? Were you able to travel, or were you staying at home?
Just a little bit of travel. I went to Switzerland, to The Hague once, and to Las Vegas for a big hacker convention. But other than that, sadly, haven't traveled as much as I normally do, and certainly miss being, in person with all of you. So hopefully next year that will change. Hopefully. Fingers crossed.
We all miss meetings somewhere in the world here and there, and of course, missing meeting with you somewhere. We will have that moment in the near future and share some nice Argentinian wine now and then.
Yes.
So
I did go to Napa. I went to Napa Valley last week, but it's not quite
lovely.
the same as Argentinian.
It's lovely. I've never been there. I know the beauty and the very good wines that are. I come from the west of Argentina, from Mendoza. I think I told you that before. And so I know I visit areas of wineries, and I will go someday to Napa Valley. That's something in my wish list. Thank you very much for being with us. We have a bunch of fellows. We have 500 fellows, mainly from Latin America, but now that it's virtual and we have, as usual, simultaneous translation, there are fellows from all over the world. That's incredible. Right. The beauty of the internet and these things from the pandemic, not everything was so bad. It allowed us last year and this year to reach out to many more people that can follow the school all over the world. So you have a big audience. Maybe we have some time if you can stay with us like half an hour from some questions from the fellows. And I would like to, the pandemic has shown several new things, new attacks, new types of cybercrime, because people are working at home and we are not so well protected as when we were in our offices or in our organizations. And so many things have happened. And what I would like to have from you is, which is the status of the different discussions all over the world in United Nations and other spaces about what could be a global convention regarding cybercrime. We have now the cybercrime convention from the Council of Europe, which I understand that it's being revised right now. But at the same time, there are other places, other discussions and fora where this is being discussed. Some parts of the internet seems to be quite stable. I would say like the technical core, apart from some incidents we had last Monday, that part seems to be quite stable, and internet worked rather well during the pandemic. But then all this new cybercrime arise and this new type of crimes, and people is very much worried about that. So what's the status of all these spaces and discussions in United Nations and other fora, and the cybercrime convention from the Council of Europe? Can you give us an update about these different discussions?
Yeah, there's quite a bit, Olga, as you said, that's going on. I mean, first of all, I just want to second what you said about the threat profile growing. the last year and a half has indicated, not just for developed, but for developing countries, how dependent we are on these technologies, how dependent we are on the internet and other ways to connect. Now, for everything from conferences to schooling to work, and criminals, and not just criminals, but nation states have noticed that and use that as a new vector to attack and ramp up attacks. This is not surprising, but it's still troubling, and including on attacks on the healthcare sector, which are particularly bad during the pandemic when we need that healthcare sector to work very well. So, and we see these attacks, these intrusions and attacks all over the world, not just the developed countries. Um, One development that has been just a geopolitical development is, many of you know that ransomware, the criminal getting into systems, then essentially locking people out by encrypting their data and then also extorting them by threatening to release that data, has been on the rise recently. Now, it's been around for a number of years, but it was also always treated sort of as a back burner issue. But surprisingly to me, that issue has really risen to the top of the agenda in a way I never thought. For years, and Olga, when I've both in person and virtually addressed this group in the past, cybersecurity and fighting cybercrime has always been very important, but it's never had that national security priority for countries or economic priority that's attained recently. And part of that is because these ransomware attacks have gone after things that ordinary people understand. When in the U.S., the Colonial Pipelines attack caused people to have to wait in line for gas or worry about getting their food supply, or in the Irish healthcare system attack, their food. And so this has elevated this to a new national level, both in the U.S. but around the world. You see a lot more concentration on this. So that's sort of the background for a lot that's happening internationally in these international settings. Now, as Olga mentioned, on cybercrime issues, and we see different threat actors, as I said, everything from nation states to transnational organized criminal groups to sort of lone criminal actors, so a range of different actors. And sometimes it's hard to distinguish between them because sometimes nation states use criminal actors as proxies for their conduct. So, there's been work in the Council of Europe. As Olga mentioned, the Council of Europe's cybercrime treaty has been around for a while. More countries have joined it over the last year, so it's increasing its numbers of countries that are joining it, or acceding to it is the technical term, which is good. It provides a good base of substantive and procedural law for countries to adopt and prioritize this issue. And they have been working on what's called an additional protocol that deals with some of the evidentiary and other issues, which I think is important. So what's called the Budapest Convention, because it was negotiated within the Council of Europe, but many countries who were not part of the Council of Europe were there at the negotiation, have been working on this, making sure that it's still robust, and many more countries are adopting it. So that's a good thing, because we can't wait 5 or 10 years for a new convention before we start moving on this. Countries need those laws now. In the UN setting, there was a resolution to start negotiating on a new cybercrime convention. This was controversial, I'd say, because many countries thought, well, we already have a good instrument. Why don't we try to make that more accessible to people, get more people to join? Isn't the real need capacity building, making sure that countries have these capabilities, rather than spending many, many years in the UN, perhaps with an end result that won't be that good? Because, quite frankly, there are some countries who look at cybercrime and they think of it in terms of content issues, like going after free speech, going after dissent. And a lot of other countries say, well, that's not cybercrime, but we can't agree to that. So you could end up, after negotiations, with something that's not that strong, or certainly not as strong as the Budapest Convention. All of that is yet to be determined. There is a process now in the UN, what's called the Third Committee of the UN, to negotiate a cybercrime convention. Where it goes, how it goes, I think all the parties are negotiating in good faith. So we'll see what happens. But that doesn't take away from the need for countries to have strong laws now. And so I think the Budapest Convention is still very relevant. Elsewhere in the UN, there's been lots of discussion in terms of cybersecurity and cyber stability over the last couple of years. So, there was, for many years in the UN, for short periods of time, there was things called the Group of Governmental Experts. It sounds really technical, comprised of 15, then 20, and then 25 recently, experts from different countries. And it included, the US, China, and Russia, but also a lot of smaller countries as well. And they were able over the years to reach consensus agreements on a number of things. So the big breakthroughs were back in 2013 when they agreed that international law applied in cyberspace. Now, it may seem like something that, just of course it would. Why wouldn't it? But there was a real dispute back then. Some countries felt that it was a free fire zone, anything goes, nothing grounded you, where others felt that international law was something that kept us safely into this century, and it was something important that applied not just in the physical world, but in the cyber world. And that includes things like, the law of armed conflict. When you really do have a cyber war, and I don't think we've had that yet, and hopefully we won't, despite the press talking about it all the time. That there are rules in terms of proportionality and distinction and protecting civilian populations that are incredibly important. It includes international human rights law, and includes really a basket of things that have governed nation states and how they interact for years. And so that's really important. In 2015, there was an agreement among all these countries that there are certain norms, rules of the road for cyberspace, voluntary, but still rules of the road. These are things that maybe don't rise to that high threshold of international law, but things like don't attack. So you can say they're rules or norms of either restraint or cooperation. Restraint means a country agrees to restrain from doing something it otherwise could do, and cooperation is, of course, cooperation. So a good norm of restraint is that countries should not agree to attack the critical infrastructure of another country absent wartime. Now, wartime, again, the rules are different. That's international law. In wartime, you can go after a train train tracks, for instance, but you have to make sure you don't harm civilian populations, et cetera. But we're not at wartime, thankfully. But below that threshold, you shouldn't do those things. Now, we see that all the time. We do see these attacks happen, but so that's a different issue. But there was an agreement among all these countries that was an important norm. Another one is don't attack the computer emergency response teams. They are like the hospitals or the ambulances of the internet, and attacking them is inherently destabilizing. Don't go after, there's ones on supply chain. There's ones about cooperation, that if malicious activity is coming from your border, you have an expectation that you'll take care of it, that you'll not allow anyone really to attack other countries or other parties from within your border. And then if another country asks you for help, you'll help. So that's more of a cooperative one. So there were 11 of these norms agreed to back in 2015. There was also an agreement that, as I said, international law applies, but also that to certain confidence building measures. So these are practical measures that countries can agree to that help de-escalate conflict. So things like having hotlines with each other, things like exchanging doctrine. There's been a lot of work both at regional groups like the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, but also in the Organization for American States and other regional organizations to carry these things forward. So that development, which I call the stability framework, international law, voluntary norms, and confidence building measures, is incredibly important. Now, in 2017, they couldn't reach agreement. There was too much geopolitical issues on election interference, other things, where they weren't able to come to a consensus. And these UN groups have to all agree. They have to be consensus. So they couldn't reach an assessment. And people were wondering, well, does that mean the UN really can't deal with these issues anymore? Is that out the window? Which set up what happened in 2018, I guess, or 2019, where there were two different processes for the first time in the UN. One was another one of these groups of governmental experts, this time expanded to 25 experts from around the world. And another, which was something called an open-ended working group, which is every country, every single country in the world participating in sessions in the UN on these cyber issues, on the cybersecurity issues. Less about cybercrime, although they touch on that, more on the cybersecurity issues and these stability issues. And a lot of people thought that was a recipe for disaster, that if you had two different UN processes who don't seem to be coordinated with each other and would conflict with each other, one that was the one that was a Russian resolution, one that was a US resolution, that it was just, they'd never be able to get anything done. They'd never be able to reach consensus, that it just may mired in problems, and it would not help this discussion, which was so critically important given the threats we face. But there was a big surprise that they did end up working together. And the pandemic, in part, I think, helped that because instead of being done over a year, they were done over 2 years. There was a lot more time for consideration and discussion among the different groups, although much of it was virtual, like we are today. So there was a lot of time to work on this. And surprisingly, this open-ended working group, which is all the countries, and many of these countries had never dealt with these issues before. So there was a worry that there'd be backsliding, that all this progress that was made in this smaller group of experts, that people would start renegotiating or pulling back on this progress that had been made. But that didn't happen. First, the chairs of this open-ended working group and the GGE, the group of governmental experts, cooperated. One was from Switzerland, one was from Brazil, and they worked very closely together. So the open-ended working group was Ambassador Lauber of Switzerland. The GGE was chaired by Ambassador Petriata of Brazil, and they worked very closely together. So that was an important development. And they also tried to change the UN model a little bit. The UN is a great place for states to talk to each other. It's not a great place for non-state stakeholders, like civil society, like private industry, who have a real need and I think a good reason to participate in these discussions about what the future of the internet is. So they tried to create some hybrid models. They had informal meetings of other stakeholders. I participated in one of those back in December of 2019, before again everything kind of deteriorated with COVID. But that was an innovative thing for the UN to do, to bring other stakeholders in. Was it perfect? Not at all, because it was still kind of unclear how that worked. Some countries don't like the idea of non-state stakeholders participating, so that made it more difficult. But at least it was a start in that. And the two results I'll talk about. So these two results have both concluded. They issued reports. Unlike the cybercrime one, which is just starting, the two groups in what's called the First Committee of the UN, which is disarmament and other issues. The open-ended working group issued a report. They reached consensus, despite everyone thinking they wouldn't. They reached consensus, all 93, 95 countries reached consensus. And they issued a pretty great report, which I recommend you go take a look at if you have a chance. And there are a couple of things that are notable in that report. One, they endorsed all of the prior work. They endorsed these 11 norms of behavior, these 11 things like don't attack critical infrastructure, don't attack certs. Now, some would say, well, that already been agreed to. Why is that a big deal? Well, it's a big deal because all 193 countries came together, or 95 countries came together and said, we agree with this. And that gives them more force and more power and more imprimatur when every country at a country level, at a political level, endorses that. They had a lot of discussion about the threats that were faced in cyberspace, including the threats that were occasioned by COVID. And they talked about some of the multi-stakeholder aspects. And they spent quite a bit of time on capacity building. One of the things that cyber capacity building, like what we're doing today, one of the things that I saw when I went to these meetings is that many countries raised that issue. I mean, as other countries were talking about esoteric issues about norms and rules of the road and what responsible states will do in cyberspace and what they can and cannot do, a lot of countries are saying, well, that's great. We're happy to talk about that, but we don't even have the capacity to protect ourselves. We don't have certs. We don't have good cybercrime laws. We don't have structures in place. We don't have national strategies. That's the help we need. And so there was a lot of effort in the report to talk about capacity building, which was good. So a success on that front. And then 2 weeks later, the group of governmental experts issued its report. And that report, again, was a consensus. Again, people weren't sure it would be, especially with all the tensions between the US, China, and Russia, that the fact they were able to come together was significant. And that did several things. It made some more progress on how international law applies in cyberspace, although that's still a very much open question. It took those 11 norms from 2015 and it broke them down and put a lot of detail in them. It talked about things like the global core of the internet that Olga brought up, the transnational critical infrastructure of the core of the internet that you want to protect. It talked about election interference. It talked about putting meat on the bones of all these norms before, so that countries who haven't been really deep into this before can help implement this. We need to move to implementing them. It's just agreeing is not helpful. So I think it was very useful from that perspective. The other thing it did is it too focused a lot on capacity building, and it said that capacity building is a multi-stakeholder enterprise involving all different parties. That it has to be, there was a set of principles that were agreed to in this open-ended working group that were endorsed in this GGE group as well. But they also talked about the kinds of capacity building that were needed in building certs and building expertise, et cetera. And so that was an important thrust of the report as well. And there were several other things in that report, the GG report, which I also commend you to look at, which I think were important. So all of that was very good, and that provides a platform for where we're going in the future. I think more and more people, as I said, are recognizing at a political level that this is not just a technical issue anymore. This is a real national security, economic security, human rights, and ultimately foreign policy issue. And so this is something countries need to pay attention to in a way they haven't before and prioritize in a way they haven't before. If we're going to get a handle on these growing threats, we're going to have to do that, including the ransomware threat. So that's good. But there also is a recognition that capacity building is needed. And the group that I now help run, the Global Forum on Cyber Expertise, is a multi-stakeholder group, and it started in the Netherlands by the Dutch, but now has about 60 governmental members, 145 total partners and members that include civil society, a number of industry players, academia, et cetera. And the whole focus of that group is on cyber capacity building. We have working groups on cybercrime, on strategy and policy, including national strategies and also diplomacy and other issues. We have one on critical infrastructure and incident response, including building certs. We have one that deals with awareness and training, and one that deals with standards. And we work with regional organizations, including the OAS and others. So there's a lot of work being done there. And the key things that we have are something called the Sybil portal, which is a portal that's open to everyone, which has lots of best practices and other tools on it. We have a matchmaker function. So if a country says we need help, we try to match them with the donors and implementers who can do it. So it's a really important coordinating function, and it's grown significantly over the years. And if you don't know more about it, the website is www.thegfce.org. And so much of the material is there. And I think there's a real need and importance of this group continuing working around the world, including in the region that folks are from in this call. And I urge you to learn more about it. And there's also opportunities to join our efforts. So with that, Olga, so since we want to leave some time for questions, I thought I'd pause, and so we can maybe take some questions from the audience, if that makes sense.
Thank you very much, Chris. I was thinking about what you said. This is really a multidimensional impact. I mean, it impacts not only the security of the infrastructure, but also economy, the society, the human rights and freedom of expression and everything. So that it's important that governments start to think about as a multidimensional problem. It's interesting what you mentioned about the changing of the model of the United Nations towards a more multi-stakeholder scheme, which I think it's the only way to gather all this problematic of security, cybercrime, problems with the internet infrastructure, as we already have in other fora like the IGF and ICANN and other fora. So I think that's an interesting advantage. I have a question. How binding are these different resolutions or outcomes from these different groups in the United Nations in boundaries inside the countries? Or the countries have to make their own cybersecurity norms and issues?
Yeah, so a couple things. First of all, I'm glad you mentioned the IGF, which has been probably the most multi-stakeholder UN-sponsored organization to date. And that's an important venue, and it will continue to be an important venue for these discussions. But as a decisional venue, trying to open this up to other stakeholders is still a work in progress at the UN. These are, countries are urged, I think the way the resolution is written is that countries are urged to use these in their ordinary practice and to implement these various norms. So a number of countries are doing that. Singapore is leading an effort in the ASEAN region, for instance. OAS is working, and others are working in the Latin American region. so African Union in Africa. So there's a number of initiatives out there, which I think are important, but they're not they're binding in the sense that they're political. There's a political imprimatur. When countries agree to this, they agree. Now, even though they're voluntary, for instance, if a country now attacks the critical infrastructure of another country, which sadly still happens, then I think it provides a platform for other countries to come together and say that's wrong and to call that out. And we've seen more of that, what we call these collective attributions, where countries say this country did this and that's wrong, and then potentially to take some action against that country. I think one of the problems we have now is that there's a lack of accountability. So it's great to have rules of the road. It's great to even have international law, but if there's no accountability for when countries break that, then just like if there's no accountability for criminals when they break it, if they're not brought to justice, they're going to continue to do it. Yeah. And so on the nation state side, there's different kinds of consequences. It could be economic sanctions, they could be diplomatic pressure, they could be things like that. On the criminal side, one of the problems we're facing is countries offering safe havens to criminals. So to take the ransomware example, there's been a big issue with respect to a lot of these groups operating from, for instance, Russia. And this has been a big issue between the US and Russia that was raised by President Biden to President Putin. And there is an expectation that you shouldn't allow these, even if they're criminal groups that are operating completely without the state's imprimatur or assent, you still have an obligation to do something about them, particularly when they're going after critical infrastructure. So I'd say they're kind of more politically binding than binding in an actual sense. They're not a treaty. It's not, they're not self-executing, as they say. Countries do have to take action to sort of implement a lot of these measures. But I think it's still a big step forward.
Thank you. I have some questions from fellows. There's a fellow from Bahia Blanca in the south of Argentina. He's asking if he could consult the 2015 meeting of countries with the 11 points of agreement, where he could find that agreement. Yeah,
it's I don't have the site offhand, but I'm sure I can get it to you. It's UNODA, UN Office of Disarmament Affairs, I think it stands for. So if you do a search for 2015 GGE cyber, you'll find a whole bunch of things come up, but the official one with the whole report is UNODA, and that's how I found it the other day when I was trying to find a copy. But I'll try to get a site to Olga so she can get it to you.
Okay, I will share that with fellows. Miguel has, he's very interested in what you touch upon, the applicability of international law and international humanitarian law to cyberspace. He'd very much like to hear your opinion on whether the cyber attack constitutes an act of aggression or even if it's the use of force.
On the cyber attack on what was I missed part.
Sorry, I'm reading out loud. The applicability of international law and international humanitarian law to cyberspace. He would be very much like know your opinion on whether a cyber attack constitutes an act of aggression or even if it's the use of force. Should we even be trying to understand cyber phenomena based on a century-old framework?
So the answer is I think you can. I mean, I think there's a lot of work to do to determine how international law applies, and there's a whole bunch of efforts underway. So one of them is something called the Oxford process. This is a bunch of international lawyers who've issued a number of statements, including one about the pandemic and what should be off and on limits recently that they issued. There's something called the Talon manuals. There are two of them now, which is again a bunch of international lawyers who came together. What really defines what international law is what state practice is. And one of the things that came out of this group of governmental experts is many countries, this is very hard for states to agree to, and this is why this group fell apart in 2017. But now they can voluntarily issue what their own interpretation is, and that's going to build over time. But in terms of a cyber attack, this is why two things. A lot of things don't rise to that level of a use of force. So that's why you need these voluntary norms. That's below the threshold of use of force. Despite the press and everything talking about cyber wars or cyber 9/11s or cyber Pearl Harbors, we haven't had those, right? But you can imagine a cyber attack would rise to that level, just like you would in the physical world. And that's when it causes death or destruction of property or injury. So, we haven't seen much of that, thankfully. So a normal cyber attack probably won't, but if it kills people, just like a physical attack, then it would. And so these laws, these civilian and other laws would still apply. Or if you're using cyber in conjunction with traditional weapons during an actual war, they're going to apply. So they do make, even though they're a century old, they do have applicability.
Mariana asked, which is the relation between the United Nations work and the CSIRTs?
Yeah, so the CSIRTs, the United Nations in both these documents, and for a while now, has very much promoted the idea that countries should have national certs, that's one of the important things they should have. And we've all said that for a number of years. So it's good for the United Nations to agree that's an important thing, and they have some language in there about that's an important element of capacity building. And they recognize that CSIRTs are on the front lines of actually helping investigate these incidents and helping protect countries. So they endorse the idea of CSIRTs, but now CSIRTs, as you know, are more operational. So the UN is a policy forum. They're not going to actually direct the activities of CSIRTs. It's important for every country to have CSIRTs that are 24/7, are manned, are peopled, I guess, by people who understand how this works, and that's one of the areas of capacity building that's important. It's also important for those CSIRTs to work together. There are a number of things around the world, like the form of incident response and security teams. That's a good international venue. There are others out there. So CERTs, I think, are an important building block as we look at the things that countries need to be part of this international environment, both to protect our systems, but also to cooperate with each other.
Thank you, Chris. I have a final question. This is a question from myself. You mentioned these norms of behavior that countries agreed upon. How do you see this happening in a world that it's so asymmetric, with countries with a lot of technology development and others that are just following or buying technology, and also all the technology industry is being more and more concentrated, more now than before. So few companies are gathering much more information, users, which is fine. I mean, I'm not against that, but how do you see these norms of behavior of mutual understanding in this so asymmetric context?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things, in terms of malicious activity, there is an asymmetric aspect of that too. So even a smaller country can develop cyber capabilities and cause great damage to countries who are dependent on this. So it's not completely lopsided in that sense. So it's important for all countries to understand these norms, to abide by these norms. But there is an imperative, I agree with you, for more developed countries to work with less developed countries and help them both in their development, but also see cybersecurity as part of that development. One of the challenges I found is as important as cybersecurity capacity building is, it's often underfunded, under-resourced, and under-prioritized. And we have to start thinking about this as foundational to even the achievement of things like the UN Sustainable Development Goals, which I think it is. So we need to bring that larger development community and the cyber community together because, as I said in the beginning, this is not just the province of big countries, big developed countries. It's the province of every country. And so they all have to work together to do this, and that's what the UN is recognizing. So there's a lot more work to be done, and capacity building, I think, is one of the key ways to achieve that.
Thank you. Thank you. I think it's interesting what you said about perhaps a cooperation between countries that are more developed with others that are in developing economies. And I commend you for your work in the Global Forum on Cyber Expertise. There are many fellows asking for the link. Don't worry, I will send them to you after the presentation. And we don't have more questions. Thank you very much, Chris, for your time. I hope that you're well, that you are okay. And I hope to meet you somewhere in the world. Thank you for always being our most very important expert in our school and sharing your experience and your thoughts with us and with our fellows. And we very much appreciate that. And I wish you a very good week and a very good day. Thank you very much for being with us.
My pleasure, and I wish the same to you and to all the folks who are involved with the school. It's really one of my favorite things to do, and a great initiative. And so
thank you very much.
The more the merrier.
Regards from our team, especially from Adrian and our team here in Argentina. Stay safe.
Bye.
See you somewhere. Bye-bye. Ciao.
Bye.
Fantastico, eh?
Fantastic. Great job. I'm sure that you have written many ideas of what Chris said. Don't worry about the global cyber expert forum. He speaks very, very fast. Poor the translators. They had to translate Chris. To translate Chris is very, very complex. He speaks very, very fast, and he's a fast-paced translator. I'm sure that we can transcribe parts of his presentation. He discussed his endeavors at the United Nations. We're going to resume in 20 minutes. How about if we resume at 12 Argentine time, 10 Colombian time? And we're going to be talking about digital identity. That is an important issue. During the pandemic, that we have sanitary and health passports. It's going to become a very, very good thing for technology, for the citizenry. And Michael Pallage is a worldwide expert. He's going to address his talk in English. He speaks very, very fast. So prepare, brace yourselves, especially the translators. We're going to resume in 20 minutes. Thank you very much for your questions.